everyone. My name is Karen Morton Clark, and I am a recovery advisor for the Governor's Recovery Friendly Workplace Initiative in New Hampshire. Today, we're going to be introducing Charla Stevens, who will be talking about legal and cultural issues around employee mental health and substance use. I'd like to introduce Charla by saying and sharing that she has practiced law in New Hampshire and Massachusetts for more than 37 years. She spent the last 21 years at McLean Middleton, a regional law firm with more than 100 lawyers, where she chaired the employment law practice group and also represented schools and healthcare practices. During her years of practice, she was recognized as a top lawyer in employment law by Chambers and Partners, Best Lawyers, and Super Lawyers, among others. Since retiring from McLean Middleton at the end of 2021, Stevens has established a consulting practice where she continues to offer services to businesses, which include workplace training, independent investigations, strategic human resources consulting, and mediation and conflict resolution. Charla is currently the chair of the Granite United Way Board of Directors, of which Recovery Friendly Workplace is a partner, trustee of Solution Health, a commissioner of the New Hampshire Lawyers Assistance Program, and also serves on the American Bar Association section of Litigation's Task Force on Mental Health and Wellness. We're very pleased to have her here today, and Charla, I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Thank you so much, Karen, for that really kind introduction. I'm very happy to be with you all. I'm going to share some slides, and hopefully we're going to have at least a little bit of a conversation with Karen chiming in and asking me some questions. This is a critically important topic, and I'm glad you've decided to join us here. So thank you, Karen, for having me.
My pleasure.
So as Karen said, our topic today is legal and cultural issues around employee mental health and substance use. So mental health and substance use are generally intertwined very, very closely. And we are seeing more and more of these issues popping up in the workplace today, both in terms of employer-employee relationships and then employees who have family members who are struggling with mental health and addiction issues. And bringing some of these matters into work, often impacting not only their own ability to perform their jobs, but also impacting those around us. So hopefully we can have some dialogue today on how to address some of these issues and how to improve things for those employees. So in terms of this training today, the purpose of it really is we're going to start out by reviewing what the state of today's workplace is in terms of employee health, both in terms of mental health, substance use, and other factors. We're going to give you a little bit, I think, in terms of teaching people how to recognize mental health and substance use issues with which their employees and coworkers may be struggling. Talking about the role of the employer in addressing these issues. Discussing how to have respectful and legally appropriate conversations with employees around these difficult topics, and then balancing employee rights and employer obligations. So that's a lot to cover. So let's get started. So what is the role or the importance of a workplace in employee mental health? As many of us are employees ourselves, we know that we spend so much of our waking time at work with our coworkers, with clients, with whomever it is that we interact on a daily basis in our jobs. And so workplaces are such an important factor in an employee's own mental health, well-being, and other types of well-being, obviously financial well-being. So the importance of a workplace in assisting with employee mental health. Workplaces establish social order and hope for the future. They give people routines, social interaction, a purpose. Generally, workplaces can be innovative, they can be flexible, and they can be adaptive around issues of how to work safely. They can support the financial security of a family, and they can encourage contribution, a sense of contribution to the greater good. Employees need certain things from their leaders on a daily basis, but especially during times of crisis. These include trust, in other words, a trusting relationship back and forth, stability, hope for the future, hope for the present, and then compassion. Factors at work which impact mental health. Workplace stress. There's not one of us who won't say that workplace stress impacts our mental health and well-being. Employee burnout. We've had a lot of talk, a lot of publicity around issues of employees burning out, leaving the workforce, retiring early, changing jobs to what they hope will be less stressful jobs, all as a result of burnout. The work environment can impact an employee's mental health. When I say environment, I use that term very broadly. This can be the environment in terms of how people are interacting with one another. This could be the cultural environment. It can also be the physical environment, the physical plant, whether it's a healthy workspace, whether it's a pleasant workspace, whether it's comfortable and safe, and physically appropriate for the job that the person is doing. And then the whole issue around financial insecurity, around concerns about whether or not a business for whom one is working is financially viable. Are there going to be layoffs? Are there going to be reductions in salary? Are we going to get a bonus this year? And then when somebody works either in a governmental type position, in a nonprofit where their salary may depend on a grant, is that grant secure? Is my job going to be there in the future? So Mind the Workplace is an organization which does surveys and reviews on an annual basis. And I like to take some statistics from Mind the Workplace because it's very general and applies to all different types of workplaces. And I think some of these statistics can be telling. Many of them are probably not new to you, but some of them may be surprising. 9 in 10 employees report that workplace stress affects their mental health. That's probably not something that's going to be surprising to any of us. Obviously, stress on a daily basis at work, the more stress you have, the more that's going to impact your mental health and your ability to leave that workplace, leave the work behind, go home and interact with friends, family, and those that depend on you in a positive and healthy way. 3 in 5 employees say they're not receiving adequate support from their supervisors to help manage stress. So that's concerning because employees should be able to turn to their supervisors to address these issues. And 4 in 5 employees feel emotionally drained from their work, which is an early sign of burnout. Again, very concerning. And since the pandemic, obviously, we've heard a lot more and talked a lot more about burnout, about isolation, depression, anxiety, all mental health issues. And these have been bubbling up and have been, really increasing in the workplace for many, many years. But I think during the pandemic, we started talking about them more. And since the pandemic, I think we've gotten some tools and some knowledge about how to deal with some of these issues in a more proactive and positive way.
Charla, I want to just interrupt you for a quick second. I loved what you said in the beginning, and I know you're going to be talking more about this, but that correlation between mental health or mental health challenges and using substances as a coping skill, which is why I think it's going to be so important that our businesses are able to recognize those signs of mental health challenges as well as substance use disorder.
That's so true, Karen. And I think during the pandemic, certainly, and I'll have some statistics in a further slide here, the use of substances to cope with anxiety, with the unknown, both financial and physical in terms of people's health. Substance use really skyrocketed during that period of time when people were isolated and at home. And many are still struggling with that. And, that has carried forward post-pandemic as everybody tries to get back to some kind of a quote normal. So certainly that's something we're going to spend some time talking about. A few additional statistics, which I think are helpful for people to know, especially employers. 56% of your employees are spending time looking for a new position, as compared to 40% in 2018. That's a huge increase. To think about 56% of your coworkers, your employees, currently looking for new work. 65% find it difficult to concentrate because of their work environment as compared to 46% in 2018, another huge increase. And work environment can mean many things. As I said, this could be people are finding it difficult to concentrate because of their work environment, which is in their home, where there are distractions if they're now working remotely where they didn't before. It could be their work environment in their office or factory or workplace, because of either the behavior of coworkers or other things that are going on, or as I said, the physical plant itself, noise, distractions. So very important issues to think about. And then this is one that I focus on a lot. Only 5% of employees said that their employer provides a safe environment for employees who live with mental illness. I mean, that's huge. If only 5% of employees feel that they can be comfortable talking about addressing mental health issues and have a safe environment at their job, that's critically important for us to get a hold of and improve those numbers. So the issue of mental health and substance use. Workers of all ages are facing mental health issues. Some age groups are more candid about sharing information about that than others. Some cultures are more candid about sharing information than others, but this is certainly an issue that impacts the entire workforce. The pandemic has resulted in an increase in depression and anxiety, again, across all age groups. Everybody's been impacted. And, you would have heard stories about younger workers having to return home to their parents' houses, working remotely from their parents' homes, from their childhood bedroom, or in a very small apartment where they feel isolated. Older workers who, really have thrived on, being part of a work group and interacting on a daily basis with coworkers, either as a senior member of a workplace, then being forced to, work at home, whether it's in a pleasant environment, struggling with technology, all of that has resulted in more depression and anxiety. 46% of workers admit experiencing depression and anxiety is contrasted with 39% pre-pandemic. So does that mean that more individuals are suffering, or does it mean that more are willing to talk about it? And 11% report serious mental health issues as compared with 7%. So again, increases in all of these issues. So as Karen said, it's important for an employer or supervisor to be able to recognize the signs and symptoms of problem substance use. One, frequent absences from work or tardiness. And one of the things I want to focus on is changes in behavior. So when I say frequent absences, is this somebody who previously wasn't frequently absent from work, wasn't tardy, and now is beginning to show those issues? Or, is it somebody who potentially is frequently absent from work because of physical problems that are manifesting themselves as a result of substance use? Decreased work performance, changes in behavior. Always important to focus on behavioral changes. Was somebody more outgoing, friendly, and then is becoming more withdrawn? Was someone previously happy and seems to be more angry, picking fights with coworkers? Just really behavior that you don't recognize in that individual. Recurring complaints of physical symptoms. I have a lot of headaches, I'm frequently sick and need to be home. Is that because of substance use? Is it an excuse to try to get out of work because somebody is misusing substances? Social withdrawal, always something to cause some concern. If someone is withdrawing from friends and certainly coworkers, demonstrated anxiety or sadness, and variations in mood. These are not all necessarily evidence of substance use or a mental health problem, but there's something to be watchful of and to maybe start asking some questions if this is being observed in some of the folks with whom you work. One of the things that I have a fair amount of concern about and have done a lot of speaking on is the barriers to seeking help. And there are many. And because I was a member of the legal profession for so many years and still am a member of the legal profession, even though I no longer work in a law firm, I've had the opportunity to observe a lot of this firsthand, where there are many reasons that people might not go for help when they need it. One is an obvious one, which is denial that there's a problem. No, it's just a phase. I'm fine. I'll get through this by myself. Take care of yourself. Keep your problems to yourself is sort of a cultural phenomenon that many of us have known, and certainly, sorry, I advanced some slides inappropriately there. Many of us have come from cultures, and especially if we're a little bit older, where we either will not admit to ourselves that there's a problem or are not comfortable sharing that. Stigma for sure. That there's no profession I would say that's worse than the legal profession in terms of always needing to be on top of our game, always needing to show strength, always needing to, show that we're the ones that are in control and in charge. And many of us would feel as though going to someone and saying, I have a quote unquote weakness in that I need some help because I'm using substances. I need some help because I've been drinking too much. I need to talk about the fact that, I'm suffering from all kinds of anxiety at work. There are a lot of barriers to that, and feeling as though your coworkers or your supervisor might think of you less positively, or your clients may think of you as less than the full service, top of your game professional, really prevents people from moving forward into having a conversation around some of these issues. There are a lot of financial barriers to seeking professional help. Many people, even when they do have insurance, do not have good insurance coverage when it comes to support for mental health issues, therapy, recovery, rehabilitation programs. They may have large co-pays or large co-insurance responsibilities, and that may really impact their willingness or their ability to seek assistance. Certainly, there are not enough mental health providers in the state of New Hampshire. And when you add to that the fact that you may not have good coverage, or your chosen provider may not accept the health insurance plan that you have, it makes getting assistance sometimes cost prohibitive. So as employers, we all need to look at what benefits we provide to see what are we providing to our employees, and are there ways that we can affordably improve the coverage that we may be providing so that people can get that help. Can we provide an employee assistance plan, which at least may provide some free sessions of mental health assistance, counseling sessions? And then there's the whole issue of management reluctance, and that's a very broad term, but I say that there are a lot of, company leadership, a lot of company leadership, which doesn't feel as though it's their responsibility to get involved in these issues or to talk about these issues. Sometimes they're afraid to ask the questions because they're afraid of what they may find out, or are afraid that they won't be able to provide the resources that an employee may need. So just reluctance to address those issues. So part of the reason that we want to develop a culture in our workplace of being welcoming to individuals who want to seek assistance is that we need to get the highest level of our businesses, of our companies, to buy in, so that it's top down interest in addressing these issues and willingness to sort of roll up the sleeves and have the conversations, and then learn more about how we can help our employees and our coworkers.
Charla, I'm wondering if you could comment on small businesses, a successful model that you have become aware of, say, in a small business where they don't have the option of, say, an EAP program or legal counsel. Is there a process that has seemed to work better in a small business related to creating the kind of culture that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a good question, and so much depends upon the individuals and the most successful small businesses, and this really applies, really to any kind of business, a mid-size or a larger business, is to have champions, where you have people that are committed to the issue, committed to having the conversation. A lot of these resources do not necessarily have to be financially expensive or very formal or organized. There can be, ad hoc conversations that happen in a workplace where someone might set up a peer support group. I've seen that happen often in a variety of different workplaces where a particular work group or a few people have conversations around some of these topics, bring somebody in to have a lunch and learn around some of these topics, and then take the ball and run with it following that, where they've set up peer support groups where once a week a group of people get together and talk about stressful stressful incidents at work, and how best to address them. A lot of professions that have dealt with really a lot of trauma, folks in the medical profession around COVID, first responders around dealing with individuals who have overdosed, and having to deal with some very difficult circumstances. It's great if their employers can set up formal resources for them, but if they can't, many of them, are able to get some training, and maybe talk to each other and just set up some peer support, and just assist each other in going to get help. United Way has 211, for example, as a resource for finding support. So if an employer doesn't have EAP or a robust health insurance plan, there may be community resources for individuals where in their own cities and towns there may be some access to some of that assistance. But I would say some of the best workplaces have dealt with it by having open conversations. And when I talk about the sort of top-down leadership, when the leaders feel comfortable talking about experiences that they've had, that they've dealt with, and have recovered from or have emerged from, that makes their direct reports and really everyone in the company more comfortable to come forward and have these conversations and say, what, I'm struggling with that same issue too. And in those situations, I've seen employers be very thankful to their supervisors and managers for having shared their own personal experiences. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, it does. And I love what you're saying about the conversations being open and honest and transparent, because everything that you've just described really helps to remove stigma, and those ongoing conversations continue to remove stigma and create a trusting environment. And then also, as you mentioned, 211, we have resources that don't cost anything for our recovery-friendly workplaces, 211 being one of them, who often refer to the doorways, 988, which is a very helpful new number that people are using if there's a challenge with mental health or substance use disorder or suicide ideation. And also our recovery community organizations that are going into the workplace and hosting some of those peer-to-peer recovery groups. We have those already currently going on. And again, those are at no cost for our recovery-friendly workplaces. So all the things that you're mentioning, and whether a small, medium, or large company, anyone can be a champion and champion forward motion on something like this by having those open conversations. So I thought those were great points, Charla. Thank you.
No, thanks. I appreciate your mentioning 988 because a lot of people haven't gotten used to that being a resource since it's fairly new, and that's really important. So the role of leadership, and when I say leadership, I could talk about, the CEO and the C-suite in the large business, the executive director, or just a manager or leader of a work group. It's very important that mental health start being recognized as a top priority. And I think we're getting there. And I think I'm asked, for example, more and more to speak to workplaces and, professional organizations around these issues, which means that people are really looking at this not just as something that we dealt with during the pandemic, to try to keep people's spirits up, but a long-term part of planning for a healthy and productive workforce. And so leadership needs to reinforce that commitment to mental health and well-being in all of its communications and actions. And, as Karen said, talk about it. Commit to leadership training on mental health, substance use disorders, and stigma. Eliminating stigma is so critical. Shifting to inclusive and person-centered language. Instead of using insulting terminology around people who struggle with substance use, instead of calling people addicts or drunks or alcoholics, try to be more person-centered. Instead of referring to people needing mental health treatment as crazy, or someone who might have an episode, as going postal. I mean, we've all heard these terms, and these are such negative labeling terms that we don't want to be using. So focusing on positive and inclusive terminology can go a long way towards setting the tone and the culture of your organization. And then, we've said it before and we'll say it again before this session is over: create a culture where everyone and anyone feels safe to speak openly about these issues. And that can be in many ways: sharing success stories, sharing struggles, sharing family stories. People will respect those who come forward and speak about these issues, especially if they start to offer solutions or resources, or if they offer support and say, look, I've been through this before, and if you need someone to talk to, I'm here to talk to you. I'm not going to force you to talk to me, but if you feel as though you don't have anybody else to talk to, or you feel comfortable speaking with me, I'm here for you. And that can go a long way. And a person may not take you up on that the first time, but to reinforce that, I think, is critically important. So when we talk about how we speak candidly about mental health and substance use, as I mentioned before, in terms of some of the signs of substance use disorder, you always want to be paying attention to what's going on around you. I mean, you pay attention to your workers if they're not being productive, if they're making mistakes. So if they're showing signs of struggle, that's another thing to be mindful of and to pay attention to. Share your story, as I mentioned before. One size doesn't fit all. I mean, I think that's a really critical point here, is that, we've all heard, prior to the pandemic, throughout the pandemic, and more recently, about, taking a moment, mindfulness, breathing, exercise, nutrition. All of these are wonderful solutions for people, but they don't solve problems for everyone. So you want to make sure that the opportunities you provide to people are varied and can fit their particular circumstance. There are many people that are never going to benefit from meditation and yoga. Many people do, and some people who never thought they would have become converts. But there are going to be folks that does not appeal to. So, that's not going to be the best way to help people moving forward. Maybe it's exercise, maybe it's nutrition, maybe it's just having conversations around some of these topics. Providing a mentally healthy workspace, natural lighting, maybe some live plants, freshly painted walls. things that don't necessarily cost a lot of money. Obviously, if you have an unlimited budget or you're going to be moving your location and you can put in skylights and an atrium and a garden for people to enjoy during their lunch breaks or take walks in, that would be fantastic, but not everybody has that ability, that budget, or that physical plant. But we can make any type of workspace more pleasant and healthy. Cleanliness, fresh paint. If you don't have natural light, you're not near windows, maybe some better lighting, some wildlife, live plants, maybe some outside space if it's available. So think about providing mentally healthy workspaces to people if you can do that. Get your employees to contribute some ideas about how your workplace space could be spruced up or made more pleasant for people. Because that can go a long way towards assisting people in improving their outlook and just being more comfortable at work. If people, work in an ugly, unclean environment, they're not going to feel valued or appreciated. And a lot of mental health and well-being is wrapped up around feeling valued and appreciated by your coworkers and your supervisors. So I talked, a little bit before about person-centered and more inclusive language. So I'm going to focus on it a little bit in terms of discriminatory versus non-discriminatory. And, as I mentioned earlier, using terms like, addict or crazy, that kind of terminology is not only insulting and labeling of your employees, it could get a company into legal trouble because it can show signs that you do not have an inclusive culture. And if someone later were to bring a disability discrimination claim against your company, if they can show that that type of language was routinely used, that will not be helpful to the employer's case in trying to defend themselves and say that they were not engaged in discriminatory action. So be mindful of that. Not only is it part of a civil workplace, respectful workplace, to use that type of person-centered language, but it would also be a negative in the event that your company were sued or were labeled with being a culturally insensitive workplace or a workplace that isn't a good place to work. So this is a hypothetical that I sometimes use in these trainings to show some examples of, how an employer should act or address a particular set of issues. So Robert, newly hired employee, still in his 90-day introductory period with a marketing firm. His immediate supervisor, Betty, invites him to a client event. Betty's giving the client an overview of the timing of the planned presentations. Robert continually stands in front of her and interrupts her. She pulls him aside after the discussion and says, "What was that about? That was extremely rude and inappropriate." Robert shrugs his shoulders and apologizes and tells Betty he's in recovery and is having a bit of a hard time adapting to his new job. Now, this could be a real shock to Betty. I mean, Betty is assuming that, Robert is being uncivil, is being rude, is being inappropriate. And in having a conversation around that behavior, which is completely appropriate for her to do, she learns that he has some issues that he is needing to deal with. He's in recovery and, he's struggling a bit. So what should Betty do in these circumstances? As a supervisor, Betty might want to show a little bit of empathy and maybe have a conversation with Robert around making sure he knows that the company has resources for him, assuming they do have such resources. Maybe put him in touch with the employee assistance plan if the company has one. Just kind of be mindful of the fact that he brings his whole person to work, and his whole person is complicated, and has some issues he's dealing with. And sometimes when someone is a little bit off their game, maybe it manifests itself like it did with Robert, because he was a little bit of, he was being a little bit rude. Maybe it manifests itself in a different way, where you come upon a coworker who's crying, or someone is being more withdrawn, or is just being generally a little bit more unpleasant. And it makes sense for Betty as his supervisor to say, look, I'm happy to talk to you about this. I'm happy to provide you with some support. If you're not comfortable talking to me, here are some other places you can go. HR, or the EAP, or somewhere else that the company provides as a resource. If there are no company resources, then maybe invite Robert to look into what some of the resources are in the community if he needs them. If Robert is already tied up with his own resources, has his own therapist, attends a 12-step program, whatever it is that he's doing, then that's fine. And Betty should back off from trying to have him take advantage of resources that the company has, but maybe just say, okay, I'm glad you shared that with me. If you're struggling in the future, talk to me first, so that we don't end up in a situation where you're demonstrating some problematic behavior in front of a client.
I think this is such a good example, Charla, of an opportunity. Robert, unbeknownst to himself perhaps, shares this very transparent disclosure as a result of behavior that Betty notices, and this becomes an opportunity to have a discussion that can be quite non-judgmental, compassionate, and understanding. And it also points up, I think, as you've mentioned, the resources. It's really important for not just leadership, but also fellow employees to know what is the process in my company, what are some of the resources that maybe they've talked about in a company meeting before and whatnot. It's just really important that process is clear in the company. And of course, I'm going to promote Recovery Friendly Workplace here, because we help companies to kind of formulate some of those systems so that employees within the company are aware of not only their internal resources but also the external resources in the community. And it doesn't matter whether it's a colleague that might be having this conversation with the individual, or a supervisor in this case. So
yes, I mean, I think that's 100% correct. And not only is it important to notify your employees of what resources are available, you need to do it often, because we've all been in meetings where somebody is talking about something that doesn't interest us, or a resource that we don't need, and we forget. We put it out of our minds. You want to, not only do you want to provide that information frequently, you want to provide it in a variety of different ways. You want it in your employee handbook, if you have an intranet, or an employee portal, you want that information to be available there. Maybe you want, if you have break rooms or kitchens in a physical workplace, you want posters on the walls. You want to bring in your EAP, or have those conversations not at just one company meeting, but at least annually, so that people are aware, especially your supervisors, because they're the front lines, and they're the ones that are going to see when somebody is struggling, and they really need to know what the resources are that they can steer people towards. And always involve HR, or whoever it is in your company that's responsible for that human resources function. And it may not be a quote unquote HR professional, but it may be somebody else. But that's the gatekeeper, and that's the person who needs to know about issues that employees are having, and also needs to be the person to whom employees are referred when there's a problem that they need to address. So, one of the questions that I often get asked is, am I allowed to talk to employees about these issues? I observe something. Can I say something? And absolutely. And what I want to cover in the next couple of slides is sort of what can you say and when can you say it and when might you get yourself into trouble so you can't go that far. So it's always appropriate to make caring overtures. So how are you doing? Are you okay? I notice that you're not yourself. Is there something going on that I can help with? And always assuring employees that you're going to maintain their privacy. Now, that doesn't mean exclusive privacy and, an employee can speak to you, quote unquote, confidential, and that you'll never share it because there are things that you do have to share. If somebody is a danger to themselves or others, you need to share it. If somebody is reporting that they've been mistreated by someone else at work, you need to report that. But if an employee is talking to you about a personal situation, you can assure that you're going to keep it confidential and private. Don't insist on receiving medical information other than for proper reasons, like somebody's needing an FMLA leave of absence or is requesting an ADA accommodation. And again, that information needs to be kept confidential and shared only with those who have a need to know. So you can't force people to give you a diagnosis or to provide any kind of information of a medical nature that you don't have a need to have. And, if an employee of yours is on a leave of absence, for example, because they are attending a treatment program, or if an employee is receiving an accommodation under the ADA because of a mental health issue, you can't share the reasons for the leave. You would say something like they're on a leave of absence, they're on an approved leave of absence. No, I understand that, Joe is coming in at 10 a.m. instead of 8 a.m., but that's an approved accommodation. People don't need to know that that's to go attend a meeting with his therapist or to attend an outpatient program. They're not entitled to have that information, only that it's an approved accommodation. So when you're wondering, can I have a conversation or should I have a conversation with a coworker or one of my direct reports about a mental health or substance use issue? Don't ignore signs of mental health issues or substance use issues. That is not going to make the situation better, and that's not going to make it go away. Ignoring any problem is not a good strategy. If the employee is in denial or is reluctant to recognize that they're engaging in problematic behavior, you want to try to provide maybe some concrete examples. No, I've been performing great. I'm not having any issues. And if you, as a supervisor or a coworker, is seeing something to the contrary, provide examples. Well, okay, you've been late every day for the last week, or you've been forgetful, you haven't been meeting deadlines, and that's never been an issue for you before. You want to provide a concrete example of why you're concerned. Always be open to the possibility that you may be wrong. Just because someone is showing signs of maybe a mental health issue or substance use issue doesn't mean that that's the only explanation for what's going on. So if the individual has a plausible explanation, that is something you probably want to listen to. Be aware of the resources your company has. Talked about that before. It's important for you to know what your company offers, and then work to get the employee to the resources that they need. If an employee comes to you with a problem, first, you want to be flattered that they came to you and that they trusted you. That's a good thing. So you've developed a rapport with that employee so they're comfortable coming forward. Listen to what they have to say without judgment. Expressing judgment or criticism is not going to be helpful. Give reassurances to the employee, express appreciation that they trusted you. encourage the employee to seek whatever help might be available, either through company provided resources or other resources that are external. Review the resources that are available with the employee, such as EAP, other treatment and recovery supports. Maybe your company has a 12-step program that meets on site. Some companies have that. Maybe your company has peer support. Maybe you know of another individual or coworker who might be a good resource for this employee and is willing to be a resource for the employee. Maybe you get them together, and the employee may wish to avail themselves of a relationship with that individual. Make sure you're aware of what your company policies are, both in terms of insurance, time off, applicable accommodations. Are you an FMLA employer? Do you have 50 or more employees? Are you required to comply with the FMLA and provide the employee the leaves of absence that are available under the FMLA? So you want to be at least have a good working knowledge of your company's policies and the laws around those issues. If that's not within your role, then make sure you get to somebody who does have that knowledge so that you can review it with them. And make sure the employee, for example, is not in fear of losing their job when they can take job protected leave, and that's available to them.
Charla, did you want to just mention, and maybe you're going to mention it, the return to work agreement options?
Yep, I think we're going to talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
Because I think that that's important, but let me get through these next couple of slides and then we'll talk about that. So you want to make sure if you are needing to approach the employee because you've made some observations that have concerned you about the employee, you want to make sure that you're objective in reviewing them with the employee and from a place of concern. In other words, this isn't a discipline conversation. This is what I've observed and it concerns me. And again, concrete examples. Ask the employee if there's something he or she would like to share. Ask how you can help. Keep discipline and performance issues separate from conversations around mental health. It may be appropriate to have a disciplinary conversation later, but not now and not in the conversation when you're trying to get the employee to recognize that they have an issue that may require some support or assistance. Again, let the employee know that they may be eligible for some resources which would provide job protection for them. In other words, yes, you can leave for a week or two or a month even and get some treatment and then come back to work. If the employee doesn't wish to give that information, don't force them to share it. You can only go so far in this conversation. Before I get to that, and I am going to review at this point a little bit of a conversation, and it does go with the ADA conversation that I'm going to have next, but a little bit about the whole issue of taking time off, leave of absence, return to work, because I do also often get asked, what about, we give the employee a leave of absence and then the leave of absence is over. How do I appropriately take them back to work? What do I have to do? So we're going to talk a little bit about the ADA first, and then I will discuss that. The ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's a federal law. It applies to private businesses or state agencies with 15 or more employees employed in 20 or more calendar weeks. There's a corresponding state law which applies to employers with 6 or more employees. So almost every employer is going to be covered either by the ADA or the state law. And if you are an employer that is required to comply with the ADA, then all of your employees, applicants, former employees are covered and need to receive the benefits of the ADA. So what does the ADA do? It prohibits discrimination against a qualified disabled employee or applicant when it comes to any aspect of employment, including hiring, firing, pay, job assignments, promotions, layoffs, benefits, all of that. The definition of disability is very broad. So a disability is a physical or mental condition that substantially limits a major life activity. And the major life activities are listed here. I mean, we're talking about working, walking, talking, seeing, hearing. So if you either have a history of that disability or are perceived to have that disability, in other words, people think you have that condition, disability, then you're going to come under the benefits of the ADA. So it's very, very broad. So most of the mental health and substance abuse and substance use issues that we've discussed are going to come under the ADA. There are a couple of exceptions. Employers are required to provide reasonable accommodation to disabled individuals, and that can include granting schedule changes or telework, or granting time off for treatment or recovery. And when I say schedule changes, it might mean time off in order to attend meetings, in order to attend therapy appointments. It might mean a change of schedule because you have for example, a condition like sleep apnea or a sleeping disorder, which does not allow you to get to work early. Any of those, very broad in terms of accommodations. Most don't cost the employer anything or cost very little. But the denial of a reasonable accommodation would be if it caused an undue hardship to the employer. And that's usually financial, but not only financial. And again, this is very, very basic overview of ADA issues. So here's an example that we've used in the past. When refilling your cup of coffee in the break room, you overhear two coworkers talking about an employee and expressing concern that he looks like he could go postal any day. They signal for you to join them. And then I like to say, what should you say to them and what should you do? This is a sign of discrimination, right? It's discriminatory language. It's discriminatory language towards someone who may have a mental health issue or may not have a mental health issue. In other words, there may be no mental health issue at all involved about this employee, but some individuals think he may have one or regard him as having one. And so they're talking about him in a discriminatory fashion. So as a supervisor, as a coworker, the proper thing to do is to redirect that language and say, look, we don't talk about employees that way. If you have a concern about this employee, maybe you should talk to him, or maybe you should discuss it with HR. That this is not how we address possible mental health issues at work. Under the ADA, you are entitled to ask questions about the individual's disability, and you are entitled to require medical examinations or mental health examinations in certain circumstances. Once the employee is hired, started work, those questions, those inquiries, those medical examinations can generally only happen if the employer has objective evidence that the employee is not able to perform the job successfully or safely because of a medical condition. So that may be, employee has shown signs of being a danger to himself or herself or other people. Then a medical examination or a medical inquiry to a medical professional may be appropriate in those circumstances. Other circumstances in which you can ask those questions are if the employee is requesting time off or an accommodation. There are certain questions that can be asked about their medical or mental health diagnosis or the need for that accommodation, but only to the extent that you need the information in order to address the request that the employee is making. Generally permitted, asking questions about the employee's well-being. How are you? How are you doing? Is everything okay? Are you feeling better? Asking the employee whether or not he or she can perform the job. Are you able to do your job? And I can use an example of physical. For example, if part of an employee's job is climbing ladders, you can ask an employee whether they're physically able to climb ladders because it is a job function. Asking an employee whether they have been drinking. That is a perfectly appropriate inquiry. It's not a medical inquiry. If you smell alcohol on someone's breath at work or at a work function, if they are acting as though they're inebriated, it's appropriate to ask whether they've been drinking. It's appropriate to ask about current illegal drug use. Current illegal drug use is not protected. That does not mean that you are entitled to ask unless you have a need to know about medications that an employee may have been prescribed. You can ask whether an employee is taking medications which may impact their ability to do their job. For example, if they drive as part of their job, you can certainly ask whether there are medications that are being taken that might make somebody drowsy or make it inappropriate for them to be driving. But asking general questions about somebody's medication use, which may give you information you're not entitled to have about their medical condition, is not appropriate. You can ask an employee to provide an emergency contact, and you can contact that emergency contact if the person seems to be having some kind of physical or mental difficulty.
Charla, if somebody were to respond, like if I was a person and you were my employer and you were asking me if I, had alcohol or an illegal substance, and I say yes, what's the next best response to that question?
That's a great question. I think it depends on, where you are and what you're doing. So if this is a situation where you're concerned about employee safety and the employee is, at work and, should not be driving themselves home, maybe the appropriate step at that point is to call the emergency contact and have them transport the individual. You don't want one of your other employees driving, an employee who may be inebriated or under the influence of, a drug, to be driving them, because that may cause a safety issue for the employee who's doing the driving. Maybe a cab is appropriate. Maybe an Uber is appropriate, but, I like to put them into the custody of someone who will care for them. So the emergency contact tends to be the first place I go under those circumstances, but you may not be able to reach that person. And the next step, I think, would be either a cab or an Uber to get them home safely, and then schedule a meeting for a later time at which you can discuss the issue of why the individual was impaired at work, if that's the case.
I think that's a tough one too, because I know of an employer that had a situation and I believe sent that person home, not with a loved one or, an emergency contact. The person, I believe, got home successfully, but then later passed away, like a couple of days later. So this has haunted this employer. And so, as you're saying, send this person by Uber. If they're struggling, I'd be concerned about that.
I think it depends. If somebody, and there are varying circumstances.
I don't know.
If you're talking about somebody that has had a couple of drinks at a work function, that may be appropriate. If you're talking about somebody who's struggling, excuse me, with, needs medical assistance, then, calling an ambulance may be you wouldn't necessarily call an ambulance if somebody has had, 3 drinks at a work function. But, if somebody is showing signs of, being out of control, if somebody is in danger of overdose, if you're concerned about them medically, then 911 and having emergency response may be warranted under those types of circumstances. But you're limited in what you can do as the employer. You could get them home safely, or you can get them to medical attention depending upon what is needed. there's not a lot in between in terms of, you know, what the various circumstances are. And I can understand why the employer you're talking about would, you know, feel horrible about the situation, but what was it that they were observing? And is there some action that they could have taken? Probably not. You know, it's very hard to put yourself in the position of, you know, saying I feel guilty that this person passed away days later, when a lot of intervening factors could have been at play there.
Yeah.
But certainly if you have an employee who is, you know, either extremely out of control, or, you know, looks like they're having either a mental health breakdown, or, you know, is using illegal drugs and is in danger of, you know, an overdose or potentially harming someone, then 911 is probably the appropriate way to go in those circumstances.
I
Does that
think
make sense?
it's good. Yeah, it totally makes sense. And I think it's good to err on the side of caution. So if unsure in those
Yeah,
situations, I would probably err towards, okay, I am going to call either 988 if I want crisis response, or
yep,
911 is clearly an emergency. And I think it's important that people not feel bad about that. The person might be angry with you, but, you know, better
right.
to say, like, you know, than have them, you know, harm themselves or somebody else. So.
Well, that's right. And, you know, there may be circumstances where the employee is angry at you for calling their, you know, emergency contact, but you can't, like you said, you can't take that chance. You
Right.
you can't tell them to go home, you know, because
Right.
you have to at least make certain that they're not driving and that they're getting home in a safe way.
Right.
So one important premise when it comes to asking questions around medical issues or disabilities or seeking information is that the inquiry needs to be job related and consistent with business necessity. So what does that mean? Employer has a reasonable belief that the employee's ability to perform their job functions is impaired by a medical condition, or that the employee will pose a direct threat due to a medical or mental health condition. So that's job related and consistent with business necessity. In addition to what we've already talked about in terms of seeking a leave of absence or an ADA accommodation. And when it comes to the return to work piece, as was mentioned earlier, when an employee has been out on a brief or a lengthy leave of absence, you are entitled to get a certification that they are fit to return to their duties. And that's for medical, mental, substance use issues. Often employers will enter into what's called a return to work agreement, where the expectations are set out in terms of performance, in terms of attendance, in terms of not reusing if the issue is substance use. And often there may also be a component of that which requires regular drug testing or alcohol testing to make certain that the individual isn't using substances that they should not be using while in recovery. That's a more detailed conversation that we will have in a further training. But it is important to know as an employer that you are entitled to put parameters around the circumstances in which an employee returns to work after a leave of absence, to make certain that the employee is safe, that others are safe, and that the employee doesn't engage in further substance use or misuse at work.
Often we have many of our recovery-friendly workplaces, if in that situation, let's say where somebody has, it has been acknowledged that that person is struggling with substance use disorder and needs some level of care that's appropriate for that person, the business will actually create a return to work agreement before that person leaves, so that that person can feel confident that when they come back and have agreed to certain conditions, that they will have a position waiting for them when they return, which really helps them to focus on their recovery, I think, if they're out for a
Yeah,
period.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think that all parties need to bear in mind in those circumstances that depending upon what happens during that treatment phase, maybe some of the terms of that agreement change based on what the medical providers give for information, but you at least have something in place which makes the employee at least understand that assuming they successfully complete their treatment, they are not going to lose their job.
Right.
Very
Yeah.
important.
Yes, and I think sometimes I've known of employers to put a clause in that advance agreement where it states that, upon return, we will be, you agree that we can connect to, let's say, your case manager, and recommendations from that case manager will be followed. And then they go forth and actually confirm that through the case manager or the LADAC, whoever, that those things are being followed.
Right. Nope, that's important. Again, some entitlement, and as it's mentioned in this slide, other monitoring that can be job related and consistent with business necessity. And that can be things like making sure you're continuing with your post leave of absence treatment plan. Are you still going to whatever appointments you need to go to? You'd be entitled to that information as well. So here's another hypothetical, and I think we're getting close to the end of the slides, but I think this is a telling one. For the past 2 months, Sally, a tax auditor for the state, has done a third fewer audits than the average employee in her unit. She's also made numerous mistakes in assessing whether taxpayers provided appropriate documentation for claim deductions. When questioned about her poor performance, Sally tells her supervisor that the medication she takes for her back pain makes her lethargic and unable to concentrate. So this is a circumstance which is not all that unusual, where an individual has been appropriately prescribed a medication for a medical issue, and now she shared with her supervisor that there are some side effects of that medication, which make her lethargic and unable to concentrate. So what do we do in these circumstances? This would be an appropriate time for an inquiry to the medical provider. And, we have an ADA accommodation form, which we provide to the provider, which says, this is what we understand. We understand that your patient, Sally, is taking medication, and she has indicated to us that it makes her lethargic and unable to concentrate, and she has been having difficulty in doing her work assignments. She's made mistakes, and we need to hear from you as to whether she can do her job and provide the job description while taking this medication. And it may be that the medical provider can give a different medication. It may be that Sally needs to take a leave of absence. It may be that Sally needs to work fewer hours. I mean, there may be different solutions here, but we want to involve the medical provider in crafting the solution, because we don't, at least at this point, have any indication that Sally is misusing the medication that's prescribed to her, but it's still having an impact on her ability to do her job. So as the employer needs some more information, and maybe between the medical provider, Sally, and the employer, a solution can be crafted which allows Sally to keep working, because under this isn't an untenable situation, right? The employer isn't required to have an employee who is performing far less productively than her coworkers, and also making pretty important, mistakes on pretty important issues. So it needs to be addressed in some fashion, and the medical provider should be involved in that. So in terms of leave-related inquiries, you are entitled to have documentation of the need for leave and the expected duration of the leave. If the provider is not able to provide you with the expected duration, at least periodic updates to let you know whether or not you would consider extending the leave of absence. Medical clearance of fitness to return to duty, as we discussed, and then drug or alcohol testing after return, if there are concerns that the employee is a direct threat to safety or pursuant to a work agreement. So you can enter into a work agreement which allows that testing whether or not the individual is a safety threat. FMLA, really quickly, this applies to larger employers. So it's companies which employ 50 or more employees and 20 or more calendar weeks of a year, and it's 50 or more employees within a 70-mile radius. So there are a lot of different factors there. But FMLA essentially allows a qualified employee to take up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave when the employee is unable to work due to a serious health condition. Many mental health conditions, if they prevent somebody from working, are going to be serious enough conditions to warrant FMLA leave. A substance use disorder may also qualify as a serious health condition. And this is generally for employees who are full-time and regular employees. So they have to have been with the business for at least a year and worked 1,250 hours. And under the FMLA, you are entitled to very specific information, not quite as broad as the ADA. So there are very specific forms that you would provide to the physician who would complete them in order so that you could determine whether or not the person is eligible for that FMLA leave. And those are available on the United States Department of Labor website. So Karen, anything you want to talk about in wrap up now that we are through the slides?
Oh, thank you, Charla. Thank you so much, as always, for a very informative presentation. I love that we are going to continue by expanding on that return to agreement topic in a future training. I think that's going to be helpful for a lot of people. I feel like you addressed all the questions that I had throughout the presentation. So unless you have anything else to add, I'll close out by having you give your contact information, and then I'll give mine should people have questions.
Yes, and you can certainly provide the slides to people who want to take advantage of the training. My website is www.charlastevensconsulting.com, and my phone number and email address are on there. Feel free to contact me, email me at any time with questions, and it's been a pleasure, Karen.
Well, thank you, Charla. And if anyone has any questions about some of the resources that we mentioned, or you have an interest in becoming a recovery-friendly workplace, you can go to our website at recoveryfriendlyworkplace.com. And you can also email me at Karen, Karen, at recoveryfriendlyworkplace.com. Thank you so much, Charla.
Thank you, Karen.